Hey ladies and gents, this is the Wicked Generation, back for a very quick video. Alright, today I want to discuss, should Christians obey authority? Should that be the modus operandi for a Christian when it comes to dealing with any sort of legislation, executive orders, any of that government rubbish? So let's delve into Romans 13, where Paul most directly and thoroughly addresses the matter. We take a deep dive in. We'll be reading off the King James versions of Romans 13. These are Paul's thoughts on how we, as those who are subject to a government, those of us who are citizens, are to follow the law. Should we follow the law? And what exactly defines the legitimate government that is ordained by God? Here we go. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no, in other words, government, for there is no power but of God. In other words, any institution that is legitimate, anyone that actually holds some jurisdiction over us legitimately, is of God. They are ordained of God. They are used by God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. In other words, one who resists people and institutions set and established and maintained by God is essentially resisting ultimately his will. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. What is the price for our rebellion to God? The wages of sin are death, and we ultimately will die an eternal death. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. And this is where we see an important, the paradigm being laid out as to what is a legitimate government and what is not a legitimate power. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. An actual ruler ordained by God enables those who can do good. He gives them freedoms and rights and responsibilities in order to do good. They trust the people to do good and help them to do good. But they will certainly prosecute and punish those that are wicked. They rule with virtue. For he, as in the ruler, one ordained by God, for he is the minister of God to thee for good. In other words, he is an instrument of God's will. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, self-explanatory, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. In other words, he's not a guy that messes around. He does not only value freedom, but also justice. He values legislation that both liberates and also, liberates not only the individual to act according to their bare conscience and their self-interest, which I think a lot of times in a very capitalist open market, one that does benefit not only the person who's practicing it, but those whom he sell his products and services to. Not only does freedom enable those who are more good-natured, but it also allows these people to stay free of an evil doer. A different sort of freedom. Freedom from a domestic threat. Freedom from any immediate endangerment. And we can start by being tough on crime. We don't necessarily have to restrict people's actions or even constantly monitor them, but we do need as an important paradigm to be set the prosecution of people, especially those in high positions, that actually do ill. Sometimes we have to make examples of them. Anyways, these are my immediate thoughts. So continuing onwards. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but for conscience sake. Or in other words, you follow not because it is the legal thing to do. Of course, you must set ourselves beyond reproach, but you also follow the law of the righteous ruler because it is the thing that moral law dictates. The moral law supports, not only the law in and of itself. And this isn't a typo. For this cause, pay ye tribute also. For they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Pay your taxes, kid. For they are God's ministers. They are, again, legitimate authorities, enabled by God and acted upon by the Holy Spirit. Attending continually upon this very thing. In other words, they take their job quite seriously, and they, whatever you give them, like for example the taxes and the support, they don't put it to waste and don't piss it away. Render therefore to all their dues. In other words, yeah, give them their respect, give them their money, give them the time of day to listen to them, hear out their thoughts. If you have a reason to think that you can get away with a crime, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. And of course, pay them the honor. Give them the due praise. They are servants of the public, and as such figures out there, if they do something right, give them that encouragement. That being said, it splits off from verse 8 onwards, talk about other things. Things aren't necessarily relevant in the moment. But here's some closing remarks. I know many of you will have an objection. What about the USSR? What about Nazi Germany, right? They may have had for but a moment authority, but authority is a bit of a lower form of power. Here's what real power is. And to this, I do want to talk about the hierarchy of subordination. In the same way that we ourselves are subject to a certain earthly law that these regimes, these institutions subject us to. These regimes, and this is kind of implicit, these regimes and institutions are subject to another law, even higher law, one which we are also subject to. You can a citizen's never get a break. The law of God. Whoever resisteth the power, verse 2, whoever resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive themselves to damnation. We have to remember that the ultimate good and its upheld. We have to remember that upholding the good, the ultimate idea of the good, and the prosecution of evil is necessary to qualify a government or regime as legitimate. We've already established this. So then, does any sort of regime that persists, that's corrupt, doesn't really persist for long? Again, any sort of those particularly vile regimes, these empires, if you would, the USSR, Nazi Germany, they didn't last very long now, did they? What about one that abuses its people? One that doesn't permit for freedom? Well, let me tell you this. Western society is, in fact, at the forefront of innovation, of quality of living, and of freedoms. It has quite a few blessings because it allowed its people to bless each other. Bless each other with perhaps motives that were born out of self-interest, yes, but out of a need to survive, possibly not even humanitarian. But did these actions not only ensure survival of their offspring and allow people to intellectually develop, because they could, as time progressed, they got closer and closer to the ability to speak their mind more and more freely. Did this not allow them to become a leader of thought, and one that encouraged and grew the minds of its progeny? And so Western civilization in time, long story short, came to be at the forefront of the world of all of the aforementioned blessings that rendered unto its people. Does any given nation that subjects people to something very cruel last very long? No. Take a look at North Korea. It's falling apart on the inside. It's no secret. They're starving to death, and, well, they're even now ordering dogs to be eaten. Yeah, they barely have enough food. I also want to talk about the ultimate idea of the good. You see, as God embodies the good, right, what is ultimately desirable, God too represents being. What God recognizes as his own, as good, is that which shall be saved in the day of judgment. It is ultimate true being, to be good. Then, institutions that stray from this, that seek the absence of God, are in fact marked for destruction, as we can see by, and latter part of verse 2, and they that resist shall receive themselves damnation. When we stray from the path, when we attempt to negate God, we ultimately do negate our own existence come the day of judgment. In verse 1, we can see that the powers that be are ordained of God. Not only within the frame of time, and I mean that concept of time, are eventually taken down, but they're also slated to die, at least those that perpetuated this, from a position of corruption, are marked for eternal death. And I also want to bring up the fact that God exists in past, present, future. God as a concept is actually outside of time, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, to his mind, these things, right, they don't really exist to them. They don't really have any value to him. They don't really have any significance to him. So then we finally come down to the question, is it the right thing to try to overthrow a government that you disagree with? Are they evil? Are they in defiance to the law of God? That's the first question we need to answer. If not actually in service to the people, if they do not enable the good people who are good to do good, then we've got a major problem on our hands. If they're too concerned, the elite are too concerned, the oligarchy, the aristocrats are concerned too much with their own self-interest and not to what the nature of the office is, a position of public servanthood. By all means, these aren't legitimate leaders. In the eternal order, they do not really hold any sort of power and are marked subsequently for destruction. Okay, but let's say we're not trying to plan a revolution or anything. What about just the laws themselves? If they're, how do we know whether or not they're actually legitimate? Well, let's take a look back at verse 5. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only to wrath, but also for conscience sake. So we see here that the moral law is actually supersedes, is above the law of the land, right? There has to be a certain moral basis for any sort of legislation that is passed here within an earthly regime. So in that case, you have to understand that if a law lies in contradiction to moral law, it in fact is illegitimate. Does it really serve to uphold the good? If it does prevent someone from ultimately carrying it out, or otherwise it just impedes your freedom, and you are not performing evil, then I think that's a massive question or blow to its legitimacy. Let's give you an example. Underage drinking. This is a good example because, well, what if you're at a wedding and people are just pouring a glass of champagne, right? In the United States, in most states, you can't drink until you're 21, right? But let's say you're 19, right? And you're pouring a glass. They're about ready to do a toast. Because, the bride and the groom, they just got married, right? This is the reception. Do you dump the wine? Do you not drink it for the toast? It does soil the occasion if you don't drink the wine, or the champagne rather. Certainly puts a dampen on things. And if anything, it can be a bit of a sign of disrespect too. Does it run against your conscience? What does your conscience say? Paul talks quite a bit about, this is why it's also important to view this chapter in context with the entirety of the book of Romans. Not that I went in and actually reviewed any of this, but we got time constraints, ladies and gents. But to cross-reference this passage with that I have on screen, but not my face, I have it on their screen. To cross-reference it with some other points given in Romans. Moral law is important and is best understood through the lens of our consciousness, right? If it is a breach of our conscience and we can't be swayed otherwise, to have the drink, if we cannot be brought to do that, then okay. It's best to hold out. In that case, the law has a bit more legitimacy, right? And by the way, I'm not talking universals right here because, let's say someone like me, I'd argue that it's fine to take the drink, so long as you're not getting drunk. And this is what's important. You have to understand the purpose and intent of the law. I'm not saying get drunk when you're underage. What I'm saying is, so long as you do not become drunk. Why? Because the law is intended to prevent young people from getting drunk and making horrible decisions. Therefore, we must exercise responsibility in our drinking, and if we so choose to make the choice to consume and imbibe a drink, we do not become intoxicated. In this way, we do not really go against the original intent of the law. We do not breach our moral law, as we are not surrendering ourselves to the spirits, right? In other words, high spirits. The spirit of drunkenness, if you would. And that way, we do not go so much against what the law is intended for. We might actually technically go against the law, right? What we have as earthly legislation, but we still uphold the law of God, and we uphold what the intent of the earthly law was. A win-win. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you benefited off this little expose into how us as Christians should interface with our rulers, their laws, and how we are all subject to a higher power. How institutions are not only ordained and used by the Holy Spirit, but how we can identify a real Chad of a ruler, a revenger that executes wrath upon those that do evil, and, well, what we might see in a virgin incel loser like Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, Kim Jong-un, Rocket Boy himself. His dad invented the hamburger, legend says. I hope you enjoyed the video. Comment your thoughts down below. Peace be upon you all, and until the next time. Oh, and please follow us on Instagram at we.r_wicked. I promise I'm going to get that first Instagram post out. But enjoy your day.